Hey, church family, we're so glad that you're joining us again for our Wednesday night series with me and Casey. Tonight, we're going to be continuing our Change of Plans series, and we're going to be visiting the narrative of a man named Joseph from the later chapters of Genesis. Joseph is a man who experienced a lot of change of plans moments in his life. And Joseph is one of those Bible characters that has a level of popularity. This story is one story that we tend to focus on in Vacation Bible School and in children's curriculums and in sermon series and things like that. And we're doing the same thing. We're going to be hitting on this story. This story has a good plot. It has themes of an arrogant younger brother, broken relationships, this riches to rags to back to riches story. And a really compelling reconciliation scene at the end of the story that kind of puts everything back together. When we teach this story, we tend to focus on Joseph as a noble character in many ways, and he certainly does exemplify those kinds of characteristics. But Joseph, just like every fallen human in the Bible, is a mixed bag himself. If we focus too much on Joseph as just a good person in the story, we might overlook God's involvement within the mess that happens in his life. What we don't often recognize in this story enough is that God is intimately involved throughout the whole story, and that the real hero of the story is not Joseph, but it's actually God himself. This narrative of Joseph's life goes all the way from Genesis chapter 37 to Genesis chapter 50. 14 chapters covering several years of history. It's quite a long story. Joseph, some of you may know, was one of 12 brothers born to his father Jacob, who was renamed Israel. And he was born one among 12 from 4 different women. And if you want to read about that interesting family dynamic, it's found in Genesis chapter 35, verses 22 through verse 26. So tonight, though, as we go throughout this narrative, because there's so much for us to cover, we're just going to be able to hit the high points of the story itself as we move through. So it may seem like we're skipping a lot, and we're aware of that. We want to encourage you, after tonight is over, to go and pick up this story and spend more time reading through Genesis chapter 37 through 50 to pick up the whole story and the whole dynamic of what's going on with Joseph's life.
So when we pick up on the story there in verse 37, or chapter 37 rather, we find Joseph. He's described as being 17 years old, and he is currently feeding the family flock with the rest of his brothers. And many of us know the beginning of this story. We are told that out of all of Jacob's sons, he loves Joseph the most. That's not an opinion. That's not me stating that. You can find that in Scripture itself. That's not really off to a great start in this story. Those parents out there will know that when it comes to your children, choosing favorites, it's never a good thing. It's probably not going to go well for anybody in the whole problem. So not off to a great start. You can't totally blame Jacob for that. If you look back on Jacob's story, his parents had a problem with picking their favorites too, and you kind of saw what issues that led to him and his to his life and how things worked out for him. He had some rough times and all that, but apparently Jacob doesn't remember all that, and he decides to pick a favorite himself. But he chooses Joseph, and to show his love for Joseph, he creates for him this colorful jacket that he would put together for him to truly show how special he was. And this reality created a lot of sibling rivalry, and even more than you would see between 12 brothers. And so in all of this, Joseph was ultimately hated by his brothers. And so Joseph has this pair of dreams, which he then went out and told to his brothers. The basic idea in both of them to say that Joseph would one day be ruling over his siblings, and that his siblings would actually bow down to him. Now, if you know the rest of the story, you can see how Joseph's interpretations of these dreams, they do have an element of truth. However, the way Joseph goes about telling everyone shows us that even Joseph wasn't immune to immaturity and pride and arrogance. His brothers already had plenty of reasons to dislike him, but this seemed to be the cherry on top. This really seemed to push them over the edge. And a while later, his brothers were out taking care of the family sheep. Jacob, Joseph's father, sent him out to go and check on them. And after tracking them down, Joseph finally finds them. But when he does, they're already conspiring to have him killed. They're trying to get rid of their brother. They had a quick-baked plan to finally kill him, to get rid of him, to throw him down into this hole into the ground. And this is where we come to our first change of plans in this whole thing. Read with me from chapter 37, verses 18 through 24. Genesis chapter 37, 18 through 24. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Now, as we read this, a part of us can look at it and say, thank God for Reuben, right? Because of him, they only ended up throwing their brother in a pit with no food or no water. How kind of them. They sit down for lunch and they see Ishmaelites passing by, and they make the decision, and it's actually Judah who comes up with this idea and says that instead of killing their brother, well, they're just going to sell him. Again, how nice of them. Thus, Joseph is sold and is on his way to Egypt. I can't imagine how Reuben must have felt coming back to that pit sometime later, not knowing what his other brothers have done and seeing that the pit was empty. We're told that he tore his clothes, which we know is a sign of great anger and grief back in this time. And so Reuben's plan had been foiled by the greed of his other brothers through all of this. And so they take Joseph's coat, his colorful coat that his father had made for him. They slaughtered a goat, and they soaked the coat in that goat's blood. And they had their father believe that he had been killed by a fierce animal. There's an interesting note here that I want to make, and it's the fact that what his brothers did in order to deceive their father. The initial plan was to get rid of their brother, first and foremost. They started out by saying they wanted to kill him. What happened instead, we see, is the preservation of a human life through the sacrifice of an animal. I think this is a way that, and possibly a small way, but a way nonetheless to see that God is still working within the mess that Joseph's brothers have created here. Joseph did not lose his life on that day, which was the initial intention. The goat's life was taken in his place, and its blood used to make Jacob believe that his son had been killed by some fierce animal. Jacob was inconsolable at this point, but what he did not realize was that God's plan was much, much different for Joseph.
So leaving that situation, Joseph is trafficked to Egypt and is sold to a man named Potiphar. He was an officer for the Pharaoh in Egypt at that time. Joseph was sold to Potiphar as a slave, and Joseph lived in Potiphar's household for some time. And as time went on, Potiphar came to trust Joseph more and more, and he eventually made him basically his household manager. Now, this status that Joseph enjoyed in Potiphar's household wasn't without its challenges, because through all the organizing, Joseph began to spend more and more time around Potiphar's wife, who apparently had other plans for Joseph. As many of you may know the story, and if not, you can go read this in Genesis chapter 39. After several attempts by Potiphar's wife of trying to seduce Joseph, she attempts to force him into the act. And he, instead of succumbing to her temptation, he runs away. And she actually has him by the shirt, and he runs away and leaves his clothes in the hands of the woman, which probably was an interesting sight, to say the least. When Potiphar gets back home, his wife had come up with a story that Joseph tried to rape her, which in reality is actually the opposite of what happened. This lie from Potiphar's wife landed Joseph in prison. Just when things seem to be going great for Joseph, a change of plan happens again, and then it's back to square one in prison. You see, from our normal reading of this story, we usually pick up two things. Number one, Joseph is a hard worker. And number two, Joseph has set for himself very high moral standards. And these things are obviously true when we read the story. But I want us to go back to the beginning of Genesis chapter 39 and notice the biggest thing of the story that we often overlook. Joseph, in all of his hard work and his nobility, is not acting alone in all of this. In fact, if you read it closely, Joseph isn't actually given the credit for his nobility and hard work at all in the story. Look back with me in Genesis chapter 39, verses 1 through 6. We'll read this together. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time he made him overseer in his house and over all he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. See, the author is making it clear here. All the success that Joseph enjoys in this very much so less than ideal situation, it's not coming from his upstanding character initially, and it's not coming from his hard work. It's coming from God, who is at work in the mess. Joseph became successful how? What does the text say? It says that the Lord was with him. And according to verse 3, Potiphar wasn't impressed because Joseph was a hardworking man, at least initially. He was first impressed because he took notice that the Lord was with Joseph. This benefit of a special blessing on Joseph, it didn't only benefit Joseph himself, because according to verse 5, God blessed Potiphar's household and all the endeavors he was involved with through Joseph. When we read this part of the story of Joseph, we have to understand God is the primary actor in this scene. But on the other side of the coin, what we should notice is that God's special blessing on Joseph didn't prevent less than ideal circumstances to take place. God was at work within the mess of the changed plans, but this doesn't mean that God works things out the way that we might want him to.
So Joseph finds himself in prison for something he was not guilty of. But again, we are told he's not alone. The Lord was with him, and obviously he took great care of him, because Joseph again finds himself in charge of his stable, in charge of where he's staying at this time. And not too much time passes before Joseph finds himself in this prison with two former employees of Pharaoh, his cupbearer and his chief baker. They had committed some offense that had angered Pharaoh enough to have them thrown into prison, and they found themselves in prison, lucky enough for them, with Joseph. And so one night they both have dreams. They were upset because they had these dreams and they had no one there to interpret as to what they meant. Joseph is quick to point out to them that there is only one being who is capable of telling them the interpretations to their dreams. That power belongs to God and God alone. So they tell their dreams to Joseph, and Joseph, from God, gives them these interpretations. which is good news for the cupbearer. Not so good news for the baker. While the cupbearer was going to be restored to his position once again in just a few days, on that same day, the life of the baker was going to be over. But after Joseph gives the cupbearer this good news, after he delivers his interpretation to him, he makes a request there in Genesis chapter 40. We'll start with verse 14 there and read through 15. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. Joseph knows that he shouldn't be there because he's innocent of the thing that he has been accused of. Joseph very obviously wants out of the place where he finds himself, but he continues to see God working through the mess that he's found himself in. So he makes this request, and while it is ultimately fulfilled, it most certainly didn't happen on the timeline that we would have wanted and probably that Joseph would have wanted. The first verse of chapter 41 tells us that he spent 2 more years in that prison. 2 years passed before God plucked him up out of that prison. That's not a brief amount of time. That's long enough for a lot of people to probably lose hope in whatever situation they find themselves in. What we need to realize here is that often our timeline and God's timeline will not be the same. We live in a world now of instant gratification. We don't just want things, we want them right now. That's not always how God's timeline works, though. But the one huge and glaring difference between our timeline and God's timeline is this: God's is always perfect. Things are always going to happen when he intended for them to happen. So those 2 years pass, and Pharaoh himself has a couple of dreams, and that's when the cupbearer remembers Joseph. And he tells Pharaoh, there was this Hebrew in the prison who interpreted the dreams for me. And so immediately Pharaoh has Joseph brought out of the prison and brought to him to interpret these dreams. But again, Joseph's response here is very telling of what is actually happening through the whole story. God is with him. God is in control. In verse 16 there, he tells Pharaoh straight up, God was the one who interpreted those dreams. It wasn't Joseph. And so he has Pharaoh tell him the 2 dreams that he had had, and as he begins to tell them, Joseph drops a pretty big bomb on him. These 2 dreams that he's had, they're really one message. God is showing Pharaoh exactly what's about to happen. He tells Pharaoh, he says, your land is going to see 7 great years, 7 years of plenty with crops that are going to just overflow, and we're not even going to know where to put everything. But those 7 years are going to be followed by 7 bad years, 7 years of famine, 7 years of nothing. That famine is going to wreck this land. And so Joseph starts telling Pharaoh what he needs to do, what needed to be done in the land to make sure that everything and everyone was going to be taken care of and that everyone would survive through this famine. Pharaoh is pleased with the instruction that Joseph is giving, and to ensure that his land would survive, he puts Joseph in charge because he sees God working through Joseph in all of this. And so he appoints him to oversee this entire operation. And then we see the whole thing unfold. Yeah, we see the 7 great years, just as Joseph said. 7 years with so much that they could store up and have for a really long time. They were going to be well prepared. Then, just as Joseph said, famine hits. It hits everywhere. This is representative of the ongoing curse enacted on the earth in Genesis 3. This is a nice little callback here to what we saw unfold over the last 2 weeks in our discussion there, that the ground would be difficult and nature would work against humanity. God's initial design in the garden was that God would be the source and provider of all that humanity needed to live. Food was abundant. We had everything that we needed. In this famine, with the appointment of Joseph to be in charge of the food here, it's almost like God, yet again, bringing the world back to him in this appointment of Joseph, to recognize their dependence on God's provision. Everyone in the known world is being directed to go and see Joseph for food. And we do mean everyone. God has been with Joseph, raising him up to be the one who he would work through.
As we continue to move forward to the end of Joseph's story, we come to chapters 42 through 50. And in these chapters, we see the eventual reconciliation of Joseph and his brothers. There was this famine across the land that Casey spoke about. And because of Joseph's work in organizing Egypt in light of the coming famine, Egypt became the place to go for food when that took place. And so when this happens, Jacob, Joseph's father, and all of his brothers are still in the land of Canaan. Jacob sends all of Joseph's brothers into Egypt in order to get food, because at this point they're also inflicted by this famine. And in Genesis chapter 42, verse 6, we read this interesting note. Now Joseph was governor over all the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. See, the initial dream that Joseph had that got him into this mess when he interpreted it the way that he did, it actually comes to be. But it seems to come to be in a different way that Joseph might have anticipated in the beginning. Some interesting interactions happen between the brothers in chapters 42 through 45. And we want to encourage you to go and read through all of this for yourself after this is over, if you have time. The basics that happen in this is that Joseph's brothers comes to Egypt to get food, and Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. And so Joseph kind of messes with them a little bit a few times. He sends them back and forth between their father and him, making a few different tests for them, bring this person and leave this person with me. And the whole time he's doing this, Joseph is presenting himself as this powerful ruler over him, which technically he was. He was now like second in command to the Pharaoh. But during this time when he's presenting himself as this powerful ruler, he has to excuse himself from the room all the time because he keeps getting overcome with emotion that he's seeing his family again. And it seems to be good emotion, not bad emotion. He's crying because he's able to see his family after all these years. But the last cycle of this happening with the brothers coming to him and him kind of doing these tests, we see something slightly different happen in chapter 45, verses 1 through 3, if you'll read with me. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. Joseph just couldn't take it anymore. And so he explodes forth with emotion, letting his brothers know who he was. "I'm your brother, Joseph." And he lets them know a little bit of what's happened to him. Now, they don't want to talk about it. They're a little surprised, and rightfully so, based on what happened in the past. But Joseph wants to know, is my father, Jacob, alive? Since now he's confirmed that all of his brothers are alive by the end of this funny interaction. If you'll read again in verses 4 through 9 of the same chapter. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, who you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God has sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest." And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and a lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. Joseph says some pretty incredible things here, especially compared to what he initially said to them when he was 17 years old and very prideful. Joseph tells his brothers essentially, don't worry about what happened in our past. I know what you're thinking, but I have no remorse for what happened. Now, Joseph doesn't say this because he's a great person or because he has no reason to be mad. He definitely has reason to be mad. But Joseph is saying this because now he sees a bigger picture. Joseph knows firsthand that what's happened to him over the last several years of his life was not pleasant. At times, it was probably downright frightening. I'm sure Joseph, as he's being carried off on a cart to be sold as a slave in Egypt, and as he's being carried away to prison, or as he's being left in prison for 2 years too long, he was probably thinking to himself something along the lines of, well, so much for that dream of mine. Change of plans. But along the way, we have seen how God has been involved in blessing Joseph despite his circumstances. And as Joseph looks back at the moment where he actually has the position and authority to punish his brothers once and for all, instead, he says, brothers, God is doing something here. God sent me here to preserve life. After this, Joseph sends back for all of his family to be brought to Egypt, and they come eventually. Jacob, after a while of them being there in Egypt, Jacob does die, Joseph's father, and he dies in Egypt. And there's this interesting story about them carrying Jacob back to the land of Canaan to bury him there. But when that happens, we fast forward to chapter 50. We'll be reading Genesis chapter 50, verses 15 through 21. And it reads, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of God, of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph's brothers thought that they were only being treated kindly because their father was still alive. So they had to concoct this story that Joseph was supposed to forgive them at the wish of their father. But when they bring this story to Joseph, he sees right through it, but in a good way. Notice still that Joseph actually doesn't excuse them for what they did in the past. He recognizes, you meant what you did for evil. But he backs up to see the bigger picture, that God meant it in the long run for good. And in this, he doesn't implicate God in the act of evil at all. Instead, what Joseph is able to do is he's able to look in a panoramic view of how God was at work in order to ensure the preservation of the ancient world in light of a major coming distress.
So when we read this story, we can kind of go about it one of two ways. The first way is we can read through the story and see all of the rotten things that Joseph had to endure. His brothers selling him, being accused of rape and then being thrown into prison for it, staying there longer than one would have hoped, again, for something he didn't do. We can see all the things that Joseph did in order to get to the end of the story where he makes his brothers jump through a bunch of hoops that they might earn his trust and ultimately see all of his family, including his father, once again. Or we can read the story as it should be read. Joseph was an important part of God's providential plan. No, it did not look pretty all of the time, but we are told both by the author and even by Joseph himself that God was with him. Not only that, but when we pull back and we look at this story on the whole, we see that it's not only about Joseph and his family. We see that it's not just about how Joseph got to where he is now from where he was. Instead, we see that it's yet again another story about God taking care of his creation. You see, Joseph tells Pharaoh about the famine, and multiple times in that whole exchange about the dreams that he had been interpreting, multiple times he is telling him, these dreams that you're talking about, they're really one. And the fact that it's happened to you twice now means that it's something that's going to happen. It's a fixed point. So you're being told about it. Basically, God is telling you exactly what is about to happen. What would have happened to Egypt? What would have happened to the world if Joseph had not been in the prison that he found himself in? What would have happened if Joseph would have never interpreted those dreams for Pharaoh? So Joseph was right where God intended for him to be. And in a post-Genesis 3 world, God brings good things out of bad circumstances. God is deeply involved in his world. Through the present, though the present world is not as it should be, we know that things are not okay with it. But we need to take time to pause and survey what is happening in our world and in our lives, and to ask ourselves, how has God been working around me to bring about his good purposes? The Joseph narrative is very interesting because it patterns one of the biggest themes of the scriptures. Because in Joseph, we can actually see a picture of Jesus displayed long before he would come and draw people from all over to him. Joseph is the story of how God takes one man's suffering and all the injustice done against him, and within the suffering brings salvation to the whole world by raising him up. And this is exactly what is done in Jesus in a much more complete and perfect way. It is through the suffering of Jesus that he becomes the Savior and preserver of the world. We hope that you will look deeper into the story of Joseph and all that happened within his life, and that you will be able to discover even more ways that God was involved in working out his plan within the changed plans of Joseph and his brothers. And we hope that you'll take time to even reflect on your own life and see how God is involved with you right now, and in your past, and within this pandemic, and within any difficulty you are facing in your life right now. We know from Scripture that there will be a day where God fully redeems all that is broken and wrong with this world. But until that time, we look forward to that day of redemption, and we look now to all that God is doing to bring us there. We look forward to seeing you all very, very soon. God bless.